so much. Thanks for the invitation to speak here today, Casey. And thank you to all of you for coming out to hear and discuss this matter with us. I expect that a lot of you have heard about the book censorship situation at Danville Correctional Center. I'm going to talk about what happened. I'm going to talk about how we responded to what happened and why we responded in the way that we did.
Excuse me, but could you get more directly in front of the mic? I'm sure you like to say it. I'm sorry.
Is it not loud enough for you?
It looks pretty good. Let's try it. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, that's okay. It's okay. So we'll talk about what happened, how we responded to what happened, why we responded in the way that we did. What I won't be able to provide is questions to the answers to the question of why it happened, because I don't know. We have some theories, we have received some explanation. I don't know if we will ever know, but if people want to talk about that more during the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss that. And I'm also happy that there are EJP members in the audience, some of whom are very closely connected to the events, and there might be some answers during Q&A that are better addressed by them than by me, in fact. So let me start the story of what happened. And the story, as I'm going to tell it, actually starts in Uganda. Uganda is an East African country, and one in which we have been working for several years now. And I was in Uganda in the end of 2018, January 2019, working on a reentry guide for the country of Uganda, and working especially during this time with Susan Burton. Some of you know Susan Burton. She's been to town a few times. She runs a New Way of Life, a reentry program in California that's really strong and innovative and quite radical in its way. And Susan was with me in Uganda, and I want to tell you why, because it sets the stage. So I had previously been to Uganda a few months earlier, and while there I had been visiting a few women's prisons, including Uzera Women's Prison, which is pictured in that slide. And the woman there told me that they really needed a reentry guide, some kind of advice or help for when they got released from prison, because there were no resources for them at all. Many of them were separated from their families or had been rejected by their families. And the practice in Uganda is when somebody is released from prison, they simply open the door and let the person walk out. And what many of the women told me is that they didn't know where their feet would take them because they had nowhere to go when they walked out of prison. Because there were no reentry facilities for women. There were no shelters, there were no homes for women leaving prison. I was very moved by hearing their stories, so I contacted Susan Burton, whom I'd been working with for years, and I asked her if she ever had thought about opening a reentry facility outside of the United States, and she said, yes, I have. And I said, that's funny, because I think in Uganda it'd be a really great place for you, and she said, I'd love to do this in Africa. And so we were together in Uganda in December of 2018 and January of 2019. And we went to the prison, and I was expecting Susan to say to the women at the prison, I'm here on a fact-finding mission. I want to learn more about your situation. I want to know how we can help. I want to know what resources you need. And she did say that, but then she also said by the end of the talk, by the end of her presentation, she said, I'm going to build a women's reentry home in Uganda. Which stunned me, but that's why she's Susan Burton, right? The grass is not growing under her feet. She said, I've been so moved by what you've told me that we're going to build a reentry home here in Kampala. So before the week was out, we were looking at houses. And I'll let you know, just as an addendum, that the house did open in March of 2019, and there are currently 3 women formerly incarcerated living in the house in Uganda. I didn't know that in January, but in January, as I got on the plane to come back to the United States, can you imagine how good I was feeling? I was feeling good. I mean, not only were we providing a service was Susan providing a service. I wasn't investing very much in it, but had helped to make possible this service for women getting out of prison. But we'd also created a reentry council in Uganda, so people who have connections to reentry who hadn't formally been talking to each other were talking to each other. We're talking about connections with the legislature. So it's not just charity work, it's also policy work, making things move forward. And I got on that plane to come back to Illinois feeling good, feeling powerful, feeling effective, feeling like when good people come together, they can make a difference in the world, can make a difference in people's lives. I was in a really happy mood. You can see I'm setting something up here now, can't you? So, because I don't travel on very expensive tickets, I traveled from Kampala, Uganda, to Kigali, Rwanda, to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, back to the United States. And as I traveled, I started, every time I landed down, to get texts and emails from friends and colleagues working with the Education Justice Project here in Illinois. I could see that something was up. First of all, I learned that the books that had been approved, previously approved to be used in the courses in the spring semester of 2019, we had been unable to get into the prison. We had brought them to the prison, the staff person had brought them to the prison, but they had been confiscated at the gate and taken. And the occasion in which we were planning to give out the books to the students weren't able to get their books. So that's curious, it's never happened before. But I'm in a good mood, because we just made stuff happen in Uganda. And then I learned that Internal Affairs, we call it IA, at the prison, was planning to launch some kind of investigation. Had no idea what this kind of investigation was about. Did it have to do with us? Were we witnesses? Were we the subject of the investigation? Did it have anything to do with the books that had been turned away? Did it have to do with something else? We had no idea, and they never tell you. But that was starting to get worrying. I think I was in Amsterdam by this time. And then I got an email that Internal Affairs people were going through our books and our shelves and our materials at the facility. I'd never heard that before. So I landed in O'Hare, at O'Hare, and it was not Uganda. It was, I remember, a cold day. It was blistery, it was snowing, there was a storm. Our flight was delayed. And I remember landing and waiting for the signal that I could turn on my cell phone again, because I wanted to know what else had happened, and there was a bunch of stuff waiting for me, a bunch of emails and a bunch of texts, some of which were seeking clarification from other people, some of which were responding to other emails. But this was the bottom line, and I was able to read it even before I got off the plane. It was an email from the warden of the prison, Victor Calloway, at Danville Correctional Center, in which 13 different people are addressed, which is a bad sign in itself, and so many people are CC'd on a message. As of right now, all EJP classes, meetings, and events are on hold until further notice. Wow. When I had left the country in December, everything had been fine. There had been no indication that anything was wrong. I had no idea where this was coming from. I didn't know how this related to the investigation, if it related to the investigation. I didn't know if it related to the books being confiscated or if it related. So the 2 weeks go by, there is an investigation. Several EJP staff people were questioned. The way the prison runs its investigations, they don't tell you what the investigation is about. And they don't tell you if you're the subject of the investigation. They have a series of questions that they ask you. I thought it went fine. Some of the questions had to do with the library at the prison. Some had to do with our website. I mean, there seemingly was not a common thread or a common theme here. Some of them had to do with some emails. Some of them had to do with how classes were going. How's it going generally? So other EJP staff members were questioned as well, and they had a similar experience. Questions from left and right, not much hostility, no sense of what it was all about. On October 25th, This is a picture of the prison, Danville Correctional Center. On October 25th, I remember I was on campus. Did I say October 25th? Thank you. I meant January 25th. I remember I was on campus, and I was walking, and I had to duck into a vestibule because it was a little chilly for me to be standing outside when the phone rang, so I could take a phone call from the warden. This was a Friday, and he said, the investigation's over. We're going to start the program up again. We're going to release the books that we took away, that we confiscated. We're not going to release the readers. We're only going to release the books, because as is common in EJP or University of Illinois courses, we had approved some readers and we had approved some books. He said, we're going to release the books. You can start the program up again. I said, that's great. It's great to hear. Sounds like things are moving forward. And then Monday rolls around. Monday, January 28th. Our classes start on Tuesday. So I get several emails during the day from our full-time staff person who is based at the prison. And I can tell he's preparing for the classes to begin. This is typical, especially because the classes had been delayed for 2 weeks. So there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of anticipation and excitement, making sure that all of the students can get to their classes on time, that everything is ready for the big day on Tuesday. At about 9 o'clock at night, I get another email from him, and this is significant. So he didn't send me this email from the computer in his office at the prison. We don't know for sure, but we treat the computer in the office as a prison, as a computer that anybody who wants to can read the email on. He waited until he got home at night to send me this email. And the subject line was this: EJP books confiscated. The night before, the afternoon before the classes are about to start, before the suspension is lifted, before we come back and resume programming at the prison, he says, for a good chunk of the afternoon, IA, Internal Affairs, was going through all of our books in RR1 and RR2, these are the names of the libraries, and putting some of them into boxes. They ended up filling 6 boxes with books from our library and carting them out. Okay, so let me step back for a second and tell you a little bit about the program and what we do at the prison and why this was such a devastating blow to our work and to our vision. EJP is the Education Justice Project. This is our logo. It's one of about 100 college and prison programs across the country. There are programs at universities like St. Louis University, Yale has a new program, Cornell has one, New York University. These programs all rely on graduate students and faculty from the given university going out to teach at a particular prison. Most programs offer 4-credit courses to people who are incarcerated and other extracurricular activities as well. Why do we do this? Why does EJP and why do these other programs do this? Well, we do this in the context of what some people call mass incarceration, others people call hyper-incarceration in the United States. This is a graph that shows incarceration rates in select countries across the world. Incarceration rate is usually measured at 100 per 100,000 in the population. So how many people are locked up in prison or jail or detention centers per 100,000 people in the population? Criminologists and other people who study this tell us that the threshold that you don't want to get above, if you're a state or a jurisdiction, is 100 per 100,000. If you lock up more than 100 per 100,000 in your population, you're likely to face collateral consequences. Can you imagine what some of those might be? Withdrawal of people from the economic life of the community, costs for family members, costs especially for children of incarcerated parents. So after a while, the social costs of incarceration, the financial costs of incarceration are so much that they start to impose all sorts of really severe damages on a population. So of course, the ideal incarceration rate is what? 0. But try not to go above 100. So you see, Iceland does a pretty good job, 38 per 100,000. Norway, 70 per 100,000. Canada, 114 per 100,000. What's the incarceration rate in the United States?
700.
Mark, you go to too many of my talks. I gave a talk earlier and, last week, I think, and the consensus among the audience members was 150 per 100,000. But you're right. More or less, right? Off the chart. The American incarceration rate is literally off the chart. And if Illinois was a country with its own incarceration rate, do you know where Illinois would be in here? Higher or lower than the US average, do you think?
Higher.
It feels like it. It's actually lower. Which is not, I'm not saying, yay, Illinois! I'm just providing some context here. As of 2018, the incarceration rate in Illinois, if it were its own country, would have been about 564 per 100,000. So this is really troubling, and the conclusion to draw from this is not obviously that Americans are really bad people and we commit so much more harm and violence that we need to be locked up for the sake of safety, right? No. There are a few key reasons why our incarceration rate is so high. The first is that in the United States, more forms of activity, more behaviors are criminalized than in many other nations. So the sorts of things that you might do in the United States, or let me say in Norway or Iceland, for which you would be incarcerated or criminalized in the United States, you would not be criminalized for in those nations. Second, the response to criminal activity in the United States, as compared to especially our peer countries, is more likely to be incarceration than other forms of sanctions. What are other forms of sanction? Fine, community probation, community service, probation, other alternatives to incarceration. And third, even when sentences are longer in the United States than they tend to be in our peer countries, in similar countries. And you lay on top of this the racial dimension in the United States, which is one of the things that makes it troubling and calling out for action on the part of people like me and others who do this work in prison. At each step in the criminal justice system, wherever criminal justice actors are called upon to make discretionary decisions about the disposition of a particular person coming through the system, people of color, African American and Latino people in particular, are more likely to be dealt with more harshly than white people. So that's at each step where a decision is made, from being apprehended by the police or not apprehended by the police, to being arrested or not arrested, to being charged or not charged, to being held in jail without bond or with bond, to the sentencing stage, like to be found to be sentenced to prison or to alternative forms of sanction. At each step in the process, people of color are subject to what appears to be racially biased decision-making that results in, for example, black men being like, 1 out of 3 black men being likely to end up in the criminal justice system during his lifetime, 1 out of 6 Latino men, as compared to 1 out of 17 white men. Similar sorts of projections for women. So as a land-grant institution, with commitment to serving the residents of Illinois, we, the United States, the University of Illinois, have a commitment to teaching where the students are. And in our current system and our current very troubling and very problematic system, where the people are, is often behind bars in prison, especially those people who are eager and serious about education, especially those from marginalized and disenfranchised communities, most in need of access to the power and resources and opportunities that higher education provides. That's why we do this work, and that's why since 2008, we're one of the longest running education programs in the country, the Education Justice Project has been offering college courses and other academic programs at Danville Correctional Center, and supporting universities and colleges in other parts of the state and across the country to do similar work. We offer 4-credit courses. People who pass our courses receive U of I credit. We have a range of extracurricular activities. I think it's 12 at last count at the prison, from an ESL program where we train our students to be peer ESL instructors, and then they teach English to men in the general population, to a mindfulness group, to a student newsletter, to the computer lab. We have a series of guest lectures in which we bring out people from campus and beyond to meet with our students. We are trying to create a campus at the prison, a campus community, an intellectual learning community. And we have special events, like award ceremonies and convocations. And it was an event like this at which in January of 2019, we had expected to be able to distribute the course materials to our students in preparation for the spring semester, and we were stopped from doing so. Just to be clear, we're not a public safety program. The Education Justice Project is not a public safety program, and it's not an anti-recidivism program. Recidivism referring to the rate at which people once released from prison return to custody. We're not an anti-recidivism program, which is to say, we don't presume our students are crimes waiting to happen. They're people who are currently living in prison. More precisely, they are students who are currently living in prison, and more precisely, they're University of Illinois students. And so we provide them educational resources, like libraries. We have 2 rooms that encompass the community library, which holds the collection of over 4,000 volumes, and hosts community events, like any public library would in the community. And it was this space, this community library, that was raided on January 28th, 2019. So you might expect that when I found out these books had been taken from the library, I jumped into action, and I called all sorts of people, and I went forward, all guns blazing. It's not exactly the image I want to use, but went forward energetically to fight this. But we didn't do that. I want to talk about why we didn't do that. And it makes, I think our response makes sense when you consider just how sensitive and delicate the project of teaching in a carceral institution is. The tension between the university and the prison is always there. Sometimes relations are better, sometimes relations are worse. But prisons and universities do not have a similar way of looking out on the world. They don't have a similar orientation towards people generally, let alone the people in their care. There is friction. Our job is to cultivate the friction so that it's healthy, productive friction that allows us to move forward. But the friction is always there. So every time something goes wrong or something needs adjusting, it's a calculation. And we have to have considered discussions about strategically moving forward or not moving forward according to the particular situations of any given situation. So, as you recall, the books had been returned to the students for use in the classes on January 25th. At least we were told that they would be returned, but the readers had not been returned. And that was my first priority, not addressing the library situation, but making sure that the students had access to those readers, which we were told Internal Affairs was going through determine whether or not they had appropriate content. It took weeks for them to go through and determine whether or not the content was appropriate. And in the end, they handed us the readers with yellow Post-it notes on them. And remember, these readers had been approved previously. So we had gone out and reproduced enough of them for all of the classes. Not that we're counting, but hundreds of dollars worth of copying represented in these readers. And they gave them to us and they said, anything with a yellow sticker on it, that has to be removed if you want to use it in the class. So we were in the position, I was in the position, of asking our instructors, of course we're not going to tell them to tear pages out of the readers, but to let them know that if they wanted to use this material, they had to tear the pages. So they had been meeting with the students without course materials. And they all chose to do the very heart-wrenching work of sitting in a windowless room in the basement of the prison with a stack of readers and literally tearing the designated pages out of the readers, which is painful just to think about. It took 2 or 3 weeks, took 3 or 4 weeks, to get all of the readers back in the hands of the students. So then we moved forward? No. Then we still needed confirmation. I felt I needed confirmation of what had been removed from the library. We hadn't seen the books. We knew that the books had been removed, but we couldn't get prison officials to provide us a list of the books, of the titles that they had taken from the shelf. Now, the library at the Danville Correctional Center is organized on the Dewey system. So you know that if all the books of a particular section are missing, you know what that section is, right? So it was pretty clear the kinds of books that had been taken, but we didn't want to act precipitously, and we were waiting for a list of the books. We asked repeatedly for a list of the books, and it wasn't until March 8th that we got a list of the books that had been removed, and at that point I said, okay, we can bring the books back to the campus, and this is the following morning when I went up to the EJP office, which is incidentally just upstairs, and looked at the box of books and went through them. And you can bet I went through those boxes of books very, very closely. I emptied the boxes. I took pictures of many of the books. And the more I saw, the more I realized it was important to document the books that had been removed. Again, at this point, we had received no explanation, barely acknowledgement that this has happened. Rethinking prison reentry. Reflections on a national epidemic, violence. Up from slavery. These are the actual books that had been removed from the shelves. Booker T. Washington. Visiting Day, a children's book about how to supporting children's efforts to emotionally handle the experience of having an incarcerated parent. The classic slave narratives. Some of you know Audrey Petty. She used to teach on campus. This is her book, High-Rise Stories, Voices from Chicago Public Housing. Roll Jordan Roll, The World the Slaves Made. Classic book from the 1970s. Respect, that's a dangerous title, I know. Respect in a World of Inequality. Critical Race Theory, another classic text. Okay, there's a theme. And this is typical and representative of the books that represent that theme. Race, inequality, social struggle. It was very clear that the staff members at Danville Correctional Center who had removed the books from our shelves had gone after books that were about race, especially African American history and the African American experience. But even at this point, it wasn't obvious to us how we should respond. It was not obvious to us that we should launch a campaign or that we should even fight back. We had other options. What are some of our other options? One of our options was to do nothing, which is to swallow it and move forward and cross our fingers that it didn't happen again. And you might think, well, that makes no sense at all. But in fact, we often swallow things that happen to us at the prison. We often cross our fingers and hold our breath and hope that it won't happen again, or that the next time there's assault, it will be of a slightly different variation. We need to operate in such a way that we continue to have permission to go in and out and have access to our students. We put up with a lot, and one option was to do nothing, one option was to wait, one option was to speak to higher-ups in the Department of Correction and hope that they would see the folly of this act. This was just a couple of months after the election, and we know, because the wardens and assistant wardens are gubernatorial appointments, that they always act a little funky around elections. So we thought maybe we'll just wait it out. Maybe this is the traditional funky period when they're waiting to see whether or not they're going to be fired or promoted or so on. This wasn't my decision to make by myself. There were lots of convenings and stakeholders that we consulted with. EJP has an advisory council that I leaned on very, very heavily. The advisory council has a subcommittee. We have a subcommittee that its sole purpose is to deal with conflicts with the Department of Corrections, because it happens all the time. That committee worked with me very closely. We also are part of a statewide coalition called the Illinois Coalition for Higher Education in Prison. And I worked very closely with the leadership on that coalition, because other college and prison programs in Illinois recognized that they were threatened by this as well. There was danger for them as well. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of emails, a lot of Zoom telephone calls, a lot of back and forth. And I should also mention that one of our funders got very involved in these conversations as well. They were very concerned about protecting the program and the future of a program that was going to be subject to such raids. So there are a few things that moved us towards the decision to fight. And I just can't say clearly enough, it was not obvious to us from the beginning that it was the right thing to do, to fight, to push back. And we realized we were taking a risk, but there are a few things that moved us in that direction. The first is that, of course, I continue to reach out to the Department of Corrections, which oversees the Illinois prison system. Of course, I continue to ask, why did you take our books? What's the appeals process for getting the books back? Can you explain to me what happened? And the response is, more often than not, I did not get any response. Sometimes the responses were one-line emails. I'll get back to you. We'll follow up on that later. Completely unsatisfactory, no willingness to engage. Second, things got worse. Starting in January, the local prison, the Danville Correctional Center, implemented a series of new policies. And when I say they implemented a new policy, I don't mean there was any formal process by which they created policy. It's just that they said, we're going to do it this way from now on. Traditionally, in the past, when we entered the prison, we got a keychain with our keys on them that allowed us to go into the library, into the computer lab, into the classrooms. They took away our keys. They implemented a new policy. It's extraordinary. For those of you who are teachers, you'll understand why we balked at this. They said EJP instructors could no longer take course books in and out of the prison, which is to say, if you're teaching a literature class, you can't take your book in and out of the prison. You can keep your copy of the book at home, and you can have another copy of the book at the facility that you can use while you're teaching your class, but it can't be the same book. You can't bring books in and out, which makes it really hard to do our job. Items were denied clearance, which is to say, we were told, no, we cannot bring those things into the prison. That had never been denied in the past. So what we saw, what I thought we were experiencing, was not a case of things getting better and better, but things getting worse and worse. There were other factors as well that led us to want to fight. And one of the most significant was what we saw when we looked around the country. So I reached out not only to allies and supporters in Illinois, but allies and supporters in other parts of the country as well. And what we saw when we looked out there was that the situation that we were experiencing was not unique to Illinois. Okay. The experience of a college in prison library having 200 books on race removed from its shelves, that was unique. That had never happened anywhere to any other program. But the larger trend of prisons restricting access to books and written materials for incarcerated people was part of a larger trend. And we could see these things happening in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Massachusetts, in Maryland, in Utah, in North Carolina, in Alabama, and in Illinois. They varied from state to state. In some places, there were restrictions upon incarcerated people getting books from vendors that weren't on a prescribed list. All of this new, all of this happening within the last year or two. In other places, there are prescriptions against instructors taking in pieces of paper to the facility. They had to scan everything that they wanted to send into the facility, like student assignments and student papers, and pick up the scanned copies on the inside. In other places, there are prescriptions against the kind of books that loved ones could send their incarcerated family members. The theme and the commonality was very clear, though. There's a tightening of access to written materials, to books, to literature, to communication between people in prison and the outside world. What we heard from our allies in other states was, please fight. Many of our allies had had success in pushing back against regulation from the Departments of Corrections. Many of them were and continue to be fighting these kinds of policies. And we realized that we had a responsibility to be on the side of the fight. We also recognized, and I recognized, that it was going to be a matter of integrity for our program that we stepped up and pushed against the kind of censorship that we'd been subject to. So we decided the form of our fight would be a campaign. And we called it the Freedom to Learn campaign. This is a screenshot from our website. It says the Freedom to Learn campaign was formed in March of 2019 in response to the removal of over 200 items from the EJP library at Danville Correctional Center. But I want you to zero in on this second paragraph here, because this really helps to demonstrate our state of mind at the time when we formed this campaign. From the beginning, this was written a couple of months later, the people within EJP and people in other entities across the state expressed concern about possible retaliation by the Illinois Department of Corrections. There's been a lot of support, and that's what's being referred to here. The current outpouring of support has somewhat relieved our worries about this. However, we, college and prison programs, books to prisoners programs, other allies across the state, continue to believe that retaliation is a possibility. For that reason, only 2 people who were part of the campaign are willing to make their names public. I was one because I knew that it was obvious that I was going to be involved. And the second was Brian Dolinar, who's sitting in the front row here, who showed no fear, didn't work within the Education Justice Project, so didn't worry about getting his clearance dropped, and he became our press contact. So a couple of things to say about that. The first is that people were scared about launching a campaign. People were scared about what the Department of Corrections would do to their program or to their students if they found out that they were part of a campaign to push back against censorship. But the other thing to say is that in spite of their fears, in spite of all of our anxieties and worries about how are they going to respond, what are they going to do to us, it was a really exciting and heady time, because we were taking a stand and we were pushing back, and we said, heck, we're not going to stop at censorship. There are so many other concerns and complaints and issues that plague higher education, the attempt to provide quality higher education in Illinois prisons. So let's make the campaign much, much broader. Sure, it'll address censorship and the need for clear and transparent rules about publications review and an appeals process when books or other materials are denied. It also includes 3 other items. Freedom to pursue education, and included in this is access to higher education for people serving life sentences, which is currently not, it's very, very hard if you have a life sentence in Illinois to have access to higher education. freedom from transfer. Currently, in Illinois, if you're enrolled in a higher education prison program, you have no protection against being transferred to another facility that doesn't have such a program. In many states, you'll have holds placed on you if you're in such a program. You can choose to leave. Choose to leave. You can choose to be transferred. You can choose to request a transfer. But the facility cannot arbitrarily move you from one facility to another. And the freedom to continue your education on the outside. And this does not speak directly to the Department of Corrections. It speaks instead to institutions like the University of Illinois. And what we're calling for here is designated staff in admissions, financial aid, and advising offices that are trained to work with people with criminal records and to encourage and facilitate their applications and their persistence at the institutions. Because we know just like veterans have particular needs, just like people with physical disabilities have particular needs, people with criminal records have particular needs. And the universities in our state, especially those providing higher education and prison programs, ought to be meeting those needs. As far as we know, this is the first statewide effort initiated by college and prison programs in the United States to push back in a coordinated way and create policy change with respect to higher education and prison. And we're very hopeful. We hope that it can serve as a model for other states or for other jurisdictions, none of whom have it good, none of whom have it easy, to come together and fight for better policies related to higher education and prison. To fight regressive policies by standing together. And I want to close with a photograph of one of our students by returning to the nature of censorship, by reflecting on the nature of censorship in a prison university program. Okay, we don't know exactly what factors led staff at the prison at Danville Correctional Center to remove books about race and struggle from our shelves, or what led their superiors to approve of those actions and to not reverse them. But we know it was wrong. It was wrong substantively in that restricting access to these books compromised the integrity of the courses that we sought to offer and the knowledge that our students sought to acquire. It was wrong morally in that it kept from marginalized people, or seeked to keep from marginalized people, the histories of their marginalization and oppression, and therefore the means by which they might fight them. And it was wrong because it was violent. I believe that this action was intended to recall to incarcerated students their subservient, supposedly powerless position, to remind them of their place in the system and their place in the world. These aren't your books, and we can take them at any time, in effect, they said. And in doing so, this action echoed the violence and oppression that was the subject of so many of the books in the first place. It was also, I believe, a message of contempt directed at us, the Education Justice Project, as a progressive prison education program. It was an expression of disdain for our values, our practices, and the humanity and gentleness we seek to bring into the spaces we work in at Danville Correctional Center. So, one of the things we hope to accomplish through the Freedom to Learn campaign in fighting for better conditions for incarcerated students and the programs that support them is a victory for those values. In this way, the campaign forms a small part of larger efforts in Illinois and elsewhere to dismantle our current system of incarceration and replace it with institutions that are based not upon an 18th century view of the world, but upon 21st century understandings of violence, trauma, social relations, and human development, and that orient themselves, unlike prisons, towards hope, healing, peace, and justice. We will be moving forward in the first instance in the spring of 2020 with legislative efforts to achieve many of the priorities that I spoke to you about earlier. I'm happy to talk about them in more detail. We will be reaching out to our community, to our friends and neighbors for their help in speaking to your elected officials, in signing the Freedom to Learn campaign, signing on with it, and help otherwise making clear your support, I hope, for incarcerated students and for the programs that support their efforts to receive a quality education. Thank you.
Some of the previous conflicts you had, do they revolve around getting people authorized to be instructors? A friend of mine was waiting a long time to get qualified. He's going to introduce some technical curriculum. He has a foreign last name, maybe that's why.
Oh.
But I also understand that there's some, I met your colleague just last night, and there's some things happening with the perhaps expanding the technical thing. I think he's particularly excited about that.
That's a good question. The question was, is one of the ways in which there's been conflict expressed between the Department of Corrections and the Education Justice Project, seen through the length of time it takes clearance to happen. And I actually don't think so. This is not a concern that's unique to EJP. We consider it a volunteer program, and volunteer programs across the state complain mightily about the length of time it takes their new incoming members to get cleared by the Department of Corrections. It can take a year or more. It's a big problem for AA groups, for churches and ministries that seek to work in the prison, and for prison education programs, but it's not a unique concern for us. Not all states have the long, cumbersome clearance process that Illinois does, and one of the things we hope to change is to introduce new processes that are working well in other states that would shorten that time considerably, not just for us, but for other programs as well.
What has been the response of the new IDOC head in response to this effort?
Thank you, Brian, for asking that question. I spoke about the fact that this happened right after the election, and that there was some speculation that that people within the Department of Corrections, a state agency, of course, would be replaced by the new governor. And in fact, that came to pass. And the director of the Department of Corrections, who had formerly been John Baldwin, became in May, maybe? April or May? A man named Rob Jeffries, who's from Ohio. He has a background in psychology. He was formerly a substance abuse counselor within the Ohio system and moved up through the ranks in that way. From what I understand, I've only met him once, he was very taken aback when he came on the job to learn that this crisis had hit him. And one of the reasons it hit him is because once we had a commitment to starting the campaign, we reached out to the media. And the media were very interested in the story. I was so naive, I wondered if they would think it was worth telling. And they really believed it was worth telling. And I think that's how many of you probably heard about it, because it was on News Gazette and WILL and other media. And I understand that he was very, he did not feel warned, he felt ambushed, not by us, but by others within his circle, that this had not been dealt with in a satisfactory way prior to him taking the position. And once he became aware of it, I will say that things moved very, very quickly. We were told within a couple of days of resubmitting the books for review that they could all be returned to the shelf. Do I believe that all the books were reviewed and returned to the shelf? No, I don't. I believe that he found it politically embarrassing and said, get those books back on the shelf, ASAP. Thank goodness we had already formed the campaign by that point. Thank goodness we had already said that no matter how quickly the books are returned or not, we're going to move forward with other concerns. And not only, and with respect to censorship, it's not enough that the books were taken aback, taken away, and then returned again. What we need is clear and transparent guidelines about under what conditions can a book or any material be removed, And what are the appeals processes available to higher education and prison programs, because there currently are none, for us to contest the removal of material. So Jeffries is, has proven himself more flexible and interested in moving forward with a stronger relationship with the University of Illinois, and we will have to see what that looks like in the future.
They gave you a kind apology?
Brian's being funny because he knows one of my pet peeves is that what I saw on Facebook and in social media generally after the books were returned were several posts about how great it was that the books had been returned and the Department of Corrections had apologized. The Department of Corrections has not apologized. They have, nobody within the Department of Corrections has apologized. From the staff people who removed the books from the shelf to the head of the agency, I have yet to receive, we have yet, the students have yet to receive an apology. I've worked with them long enough, I don't expect an apology, but I think given the relationship between the University of Illinois and the Department of Corrections and the need to develop trust so that we can expand the program, an apology would be very appropriate. That's what professional partners do. Chris?
Thank you for the great work you and EJP do. The question I have to ask was about the fourth goal or aspect.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm going to ask about that. You mentioned hopefully working towards getting advisory just for people who've been incarcerated before. How have talks started yet? And if so, okay.
No, I'm sorry, I'm nodding, I must say yes.
So, does it sound realistic anytime soon?
So this is one of our priorities. One of the things that we're at the middle, in the process of doing now is trying to decide which of the priorities will best be met through legislative change and which through administrative directives, which are internal to the Department of Corrections, or policy within individual universities. And we don't have answers to all those questions. We do know that there are some universities currently in Illinois who have designated people in their admissions offices, for example, who are trained to work with people with criminal records. So we know it's not rocket science. We know it's not an onerous expense. We know it can be done, and we will be making that case. I would love to see, and there are others who would love to see, most of this pushed through legislatively. Why? Because we don't trust the Department of Corrections, and we think the legislature is the appropriate body to be ruling and making laws. We think it's an appropriate body for making laws related to prisons and the practices related to incarcerated people in the state. And I would love to see that responded to legislatively, but we don't know yet. Thank you. Mark?
I know you said that your program is not a public safety program, it's not an anti-recidivism program. However, given my liberal bias, I have to believe that giving people access to education and learning is going to benefit them, but it's also going to benefit the prison at large and the prison population. Because the people who want to be in this kind of program, I would expect, and maybe this is my naivete, that they would want to behave well and to encourage a nice environment so that they can continue that. Do you think that's true? And do the people running the prison, are they somehow not able to see that or communicate that with their higher ups? Is that a reasonable question?
It's a reasonable question, thank you. Yes, it's true. Oh, repeat the question. The question is, although I'm reluctant to characterize our work as public safety work, surely there are public safety benefits associated with higher education in prison. And yes, you're absolutely right. There are many studies that point to the benefits for staff and incarcerated people at a prison where there's a higher education in prison system, that acts of violence tend to go down. There are all sorts of reasons that might happen. And yes, people are aware of that. There's lots of anecdotal evidence among correctional officers and others at the Danville Correctional Center, for example, who will say, gee, ever since you guys have come in here, everything's so much calmer, so on. And it's not the case that that doesn't matter. What I like to emphasize, though, is that we don't go in with the aim of creating a safer prison. But yes, it does have those benefits. And it's not the case, it's more obvious in some, within the prison system, it tends to be the people at the top who are most liberal, or least, or most, what's the word, least reactionary, and the people at the, that's not the right image to use, the people who are working on the ground, who tend to be the hardest ones sometimes to work closely with. And it's partly, I'll say, because of educational background. The directors and the assistant directors tend to have graduate degrees. They've read the studies, they've read the same studies that I have that point to lower incidence of violence in prisons with higher education and prison programs, for example. The people on the ground work in an awful position. Awful position. People who are correctional officers have high degrees of suicide, high degrees of substance abuse and alcoholism, high degrees of domestic violence. They tend to have higher rates of mortality even after they retire, and they can retire at very early ages because 20 years in and you're out. They tend to die more often. They tend to die earlier. I mean, it's an awful position, lots of mental health issues, and many of them resent the fact that we're there. I can see that. Many of them will tell us, I'm having to work really hard to put my child through school. Maybe I should tell them to go out and kill somebody, and then you'll come and teach them for free. We don't have a system, generally, in the United States that offers quality, free, higher education to people. And resentments are kind of inevitable in this sort of system. Bill?
What's been the political response in the state of Illinois?
So we're really lucky, thank you for asking, to be able to work with our wonderful state rep, Carol Ammons, who has been a very big, very loud supporter of the Freedom to Learn campaign. We're also working closely with LaShawn Ford, who's a state rep up in the Chicagoland area. And there are others who have been very interested to learn more about the values of higher education in prison, why it's good not just for the students who are getting the education, but for family members and for the communities to which they return. One of the things I didn't mention is that there was a subject matter hearing on censorship in state prisons in July of this year, which really did provide us an opportunity, a really lovely opportunity, to make the case for, Holly Klingon was one of the other people who spoke at that hearing, for higher education in prison and the benefits for the state. So I believe that this is also one of those issues that crosses to some degree party lines. So we're encouraged that legislators seem to be paying attention to the fact that other states are enacting criminal justice reform. They don't want, it's not the way I think about our work, but that's how many of them think about it. They don't want Illinois to be lagging too far behind. And so there seems to be an appetite right now. Some of that is directed by the governor, who has made, his lieutenant governor has made criminal justice reform a priority. And we've gotten support from her office as well. So it does seem to be a good time, politically speaking, to be moving forward with the agenda of the Freedom to Learn campaign. Dottie.
Hi, is the Freedom to Learn campaign just in Illinois, or is that national?
It's just in Illinois. I'm laughing because we've had some people contact us and say, hey, can we do a Freedom to Learn campaign in our state? And I love the idea, but we're not running any other Freedom to Learn campaigns. I hope it's successful. I hope it catches on. I hope people find that the name is not mine. Chris Rivers, who's up at DePaul, came up with the name. I think it's a wonderful name, Freedom to Learn. And I hope it will spread. But currently it's just an Illinois campaign.
I saw references to the NPR story on Facebook posts by Nicholas California.
Oh, that's great.
So, anyhow,
Yeah, that's what we're going for that. And as the Freedom, as Carol and LaShawn and Carol Ammons and LaShawn Ford and others submit legislation in the spring, we will be ramping up. We have a new website that will be launched, hopefully, the Freedom to Learn campaign, that will be launched next week. We will be pushing that out, and we encourage you to share it with your friends. And as I said in the talk, we will be asking people to let their legislators know how they feel about many elements of the campaign that speak to you, and encourage them to vote in support of it. One thing that I want to highlight, thanks for giving me the opportunity, is that the Freedom to Learn campaign is not an organization. And we specifically and strategically chose to fight the censorship, not by forming an organization that would have to publicly declare its officers and its board of directors and so on. It was partly out of the desire for flexibility and nimbleness, and it was partly out of fear, because we wanted to be able to operate in such a way that we didn't, that all of us didn't have to declare our identities. And a campaign, it rises to the occasion, and then it disappears when the occasion is no longer called for. Then it may rise up again, and it may disappear again. So it gives us a lot more opportunity to respond flexibly to what the demands of any given moment are. Oh, thank you. So we are happy to be co-sponsoring with the campus YMCA the exhibit that's going to be opening next week. It features some EJP alum. And the opening reception is Thursday, October 24th from 5 to 7 p.m. in the Murphy Lounge. I've seen many of the photographs that are part of this exhibit, and you can too, on the cover of this postcard. They're incredibly moving. And the narratives that accompany the photographs will make you cry. It's not just about these 18 men and women and the wonderful things they've been able to accomplish since their release from serving long sentences. It prompts us to think about whether we ought to be sentencing people for a long time in the first place. And what are the costs of the overly long, overly punitive sentences that American courts give to people. Most of the people here sentenced as children, released decades later as adults. So I hope you can attend the opening on the 24th, next Thursday, and please come by the exhibit and enjoy the very moving pieces that are part of it. Thank you, Anne.
Is there a waiting list for the books that the administration doesn't want people to read?
A waiting list?
I'm just thinking, censoring books is a good way for getting interested in them, so I'm wondering, let's joke.
Okay.
A waiting list for the books.
I will say that we've had, since the media got hold of the story and it's been brought to people's attention, the Prison Danville Correctional Center has instituted a new process for approving books, and things have never moved so quickly. We're getting books approved in a couple of days where it used to take months and months. And nothing has been denied since January. And we do welcome people's donations and contributions to the library. This is a good opportunity for us to expand it and grow it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.